What we're doing here today is we're publishing the Labour Party's private members' bill on agency workers. As you know, we debated this issue in Dáil last week with a motion calling on the government to introduce legislation to protect the rights and ensure that there are basic rights for agency workers. Willie Penrose will briefly outline the main provisions that are in our bill, and I'm joined here also with Deputy Leader Joan Burton and Senator Alex White. There is a problem in this country with, I suppose, what we broadly call low pay and income inequality. And it is a problem that the Labour Party is determined to address. One of our colleagues, Deputy Kieran Ridge, got a reply to a Dáil question some weeks ago, which showed that 1.5 million people in this country are declaring income of less than 38,000 a year as their income to the revenue commissioners. We chose the 38,000 because that was the level of increase that the Taoiseach is proposing to pay himself under the award that he was given. 1.5 million getting less than that amount themselves.
You said this originates from our motion, but we have been working. This also has its origins in a commitment we gave at the Labour Party conference in November in Wexford, which basically stated we gave that commitment on the floor of the conference, and indeed it indicates that we take the views of the grassroots of the Labour Party seriously. Indeed, we had numerous discussions with the trade union movement in relation to this matter, and of course the very essential element of this, without going into each and every section, is that it entrenches in legislation the non-discrimination principle. Many states have reinforced equal treatment or non-discrimination principle with additional measure to ensure the agency work was used for bona fide reasons. And I mean that can be done as well. It can be utilised for specific reasons, or the duration of the agency work can be limited, or actually some states have set limits to the sectors and occupation usage. But our bill is around, and like many bills, we don't pretend that it's the be all and end all. Our function is to get it onto the floor of the Dáil, and indeed Senator Alex White, my colleague who has worked on this bill as well, will be getting it onto the floor of the Shannon. So we are going to utilise every available opportunity at Oireachtas level so to ensure that this is advanced. We're not going to give the government any excuses for a failure to do something that is so fundamental as this in this context. They have used up all their excuses now. In question time in relation to the debate we had last week, we have a plethora of excuses coming forward, none of them of any substance in our view. And basically, I mean, if other member states can do it, including some of the new member states, and here are we entrenched along with Britain, being to the forefront. And so therefore we find that we actually have power the position being taken, as indeed is the trade union movement. And I think the government should well acknowledge the warnings that are coming from the trade union movement, that this will be a key issue in the context of the forthcoming talks, and so therefore they will be well advised to take cognizance of this bill, and we will facilitate them. This is an issue now that's not going to leave the agenda. It's something that's fundamental to the Labour Party. It goes back to 1912 and 1913 with us. This is where we are now. And you might say, well, that's 90 odd years ago, 95 years ago. That makes no difference insofar as that we believe that this is too important, too fundamental, and I see NERA having a major role in overseeing that.
But the other thing is, of course, that there's a provision in the bill for complaints to be made to a rights commissioner and then on appeal to the Labour Court. So that's the mechanism that's provided for in the bill. But I mean, people are right to identify a problem with enforcement, because the difficulty is that people very often don't know what their rights are, and that's something that we've seen. Whereas there are quite a lot of provisions in employment legislation, very often people don't know that they're there. And agency workers are particularly isolated because they're not immediately organised in trade unions. There's a difficulty for trade unions in even having access to them or knowing where they are, able to find them in order to recruit them and organise them, which is a very important part of enforcement. But the fact is, there's no point in even talking about enforcement, there's no point in even having the debate about enforcement if the actual basic provisions aren't put in place. And that's what we're proposing to do here.
This bill is the fact that it's coming at a time when there is a slowdown in the economy, and when in fact there is pressure for the first time in a long time in relation to unemployment. We are, all of the forecasts, including the Minister for Finance's own forecasts, suggest that there could be up to a 1% increase in unemployment over the next year. This means that the pressure on workers who are becoming redundant, particularly people becoming redundant in the construction industry, is that if we continue to have a completely unregulated agency market, those construction workers, including Irish construction workers, will face no real opportunity of getting replacement employment because effectively in the race to the bottom they will be outbid by the kind of wages that agency workers will work for if they're brought over through the kind of agreements and arrangements that we've become familiar with. And you know, it's a bit like the issue around taxation. Some employers don't just want low taxation, they want no taxation. Some employers don't just want to pay the minimum wage, they want to in fact go way below the minimum wage. And it is a fundamental issue, as Deputy Willie Penrose was saying, for the labour movement, that the rights to terms and conditions that have been hard-won over more than 100 years right throughout Europe shouldn't be easily cast away. The government has been talking out of both sides of their mouth on this. It may well be that they're reserving this for negotiations in relation to the forthcoming wages negotiations and partnership discussions. But you know, particularly with the change in employment and the growing spectre of unemployment, we're talking about perhaps 36,000 people this year becoming unemployed from the construction industry alone. And now more than ever, we actually need this legislation, and as has been said, we will cooperate fully with the government to introduce what is actually a modest measure of protection for workers.